Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Mom and Dad. This is actually a re review because ultimately I went through and did this review at some point before, and reasonably what had happened, it had been bugging me to no end that I mispronounced one of the actress's name in the movie. So, I'm just like, you know what? Maybe when going through this, maybe I will actually have a better review on my hands than originally, or maybe not. Who knows? But going into this, I hope to very much better get some actors' names right or some character names right and this and that. Ultimately, this is another Nicolas Cage movie. Reasonably, to me, this is a really fun concept. It's just a really fun overall approach. Basically, it's kind of like any number of the movie The Crazies, or it kind of feels like uh, when basically it kind of feels like a zombie movie if the zombies were smarter. But overall, this is kind of like a generation attacking another generation. Basically, the tagline is "I put you into this world and I can take you out," kind of thing. When going into this movie, I found it to be very fun because ultimately it is really just, hey, wait till these parents start attacking these kids. Wait to this moment till they go and find something to go and start hacking away. Because ultimately, depending on what age range you are, you could either um, root for the younger generation, or ultimately you could be the parent that's like, you know what, hey, yeah, maybe they deserve to, like, maybe them not being so glued to their phones, or maybe you can even be wrapped into the much even elderly generation that appears in this movie. That ultimately it's just like, yeah, like I can root for them, or who knows. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like generation fighting generation, and it's an interesting story. And I found it to be very fun because ultimately you have Nicolas Cage delivering a lot of hilarious or iconic things going on within this movie. So, going into this movie, there is going to be some moments in this movie that may confuse some people because ultimately there might be some timeline like stuff that is going to appear in this movie that is going to be okay. Like, this is like 3 weeks before this whole event happens, or there's going to be one scene that happens years before that they allude to later and showcase what happened during this seemingly random scene that Nicolas Cage keeps popping into his own head. And so reasonably there might be some confusion there, and maybe I hope I can clear that up. But anyways, we really have, I think, Brent and Kendall, Nicolas Cage and Selma Blair's character, that are kind of going through very much a midlife crisis. It seems like Selma Blair is looking at maybe another man that she knows from her past to make her feel good about herself. And Brent is looking into a pool table to draw himself some seclusion for the rest of the home because he himself is really wanting to give himself maybe his own man cave, or ultimately a quasi family like room that he doesn't want to have a family in, really. So, going into this movie, it's very interesting. It's very fun, and at the end of the day, it's like hoping, kind of hoping to just be like, okay, who are you gonna root for? And that's really what this movie is. It's kind of hard to explain because ultimately, once this movie eventually gets going, then you're like, oh, I get it. So it's just kind of like, okay, you have every single mom and dad in the world attacking um, their next of kin, because ultimately that's what the goal is. It's some bizarrish mechanism that is reversing how a lot of parents would go and immediately desperately try to save their children, but instead it is trying to do the exact opposite. It is like, I want to uh, take out my next generational child. So basically, that is the approach of this movie, and at the end of the day, it's a really fun film. So go ahead and check it out. Reasonably within this movie, there is kind of some like annoying generational thing where it has like the younger kid that is like glued to their phone and ultimately are very much getting into trouble, and you can ultimately whether or not decide where you're at within this movie, where you're rooting for the parents or rooting against the parents, or ultimately going into whatever kind of mode that you would want to go into this movie. So let's go into this film, because there's a lot more to talk about it in spoiler terms than there is to learn about it in cryptic like sense. So let's go into the spoiler time. Yeah, it's like I said, it's hilarity ensues. So let's go through the spoilers. Spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm gonna do spoil this movie. So we ultimately have everybody just kind of getting up in the morning. It's a normal, seemingly normal day. We ultimately have a the oldest of the two kids, Carly, glued to her phone, calling and or texting her boyfriend, asking if they are going to get together to go to the movies, and ultimately Carly's boyfriend, I think his name is Damon, is doing his SATs test, and ultimately he's worried whether or not he's going to do well on SATs, because ultimately he had spent so much time with her that he didn't like study that well, but he took a lot of practice tests. So ultimately, Nicolas Cage is getting up in the morning, tickling his son, getting ready for the day. Ultimately, being told that uh, his housekeeper is telling him what food is going to be prepared or something like that, and he's like, "Yeah, f that," but he's like, "Okay, sure." Like, under his breath, he's just like, "Ugh," like whatever. So ultimately, we have Selma Blair, who is ultimately driving her daughter to school. Ultimately, she is going through her social medias because this girl is completely glued to her phone, to the point where she gets in trouble at school with her phone. So ultimately, we have Selma's character that is ultimately uh, mentioning to her daughter that like she misses the time that they have together or had together. Seemed like at one point they were best friends and ultimately they could tell one another anything, and that ultimately like it seems like their parents are both kind of not liking her boyfriend Damon just because it seems like he exists. It doesn't really seem like they know much about him. It's just they don't like him for reasons I don't quite understand. So going into this, we have it to where reasonably gets to the point to where like the mom is talking to the daughter and how like they've heavily disconnected, and that like reasonably she hates the fact that they've grown so apart, and reasonably Carly fires back with, "It's not my fault that you couldn't get a life of your own." Because evidently Carly's life is so great and she has so many friends at the end of the day, she has to steal money from her mother's wallet to pay for drugs at school. So ultimately, there is a point here where I'm going to adjust to tell some past like story. So realize that is coming. So yeah, we're gonna get to a point of mainly focusing on Carly, and then we're gonna stop and transition into some other characters, and then we'll come back to Carly, come back to the school, and come back to this craziness, or come back to a point where it gets crazy. So we have Carly who goes to school, and what ends up happening is that she goes to school. She is very much being a normal kid in class that ultimately gets in trouble because ultimately Joseph, the actor's name Joseph, but her her teacher ultimately is doing a thing in class. Ultimately, he sees one girl that ultimately is texting too much on her phone. He grabs her phone from her and tells her, "Okay, you'll get this by the end of class." Ultimately, he texts somebody on her phone, and it's Carly to let her know, "Hey, you can also bring your phone up to the front of the class." And Carly looks up at the teacher, and he's like, and she's like, "Okay, sure. So here you go." So basically, he does a whole thing about how there is um, a very much products that are to be aged out. To ultimately, every single person has to go and get the new model of something like a gaming console, or like he presents a phone. Ultimately, every time you have to go and get the new iPhone a billion, or you have to go and get PS 95 or PlayStation 95 or whatever the heck number it's going to be, because ultimately you need to keep getting the next year's model, because ultimately that is the perfect thing that it is trying to mention here, is that eventually it's going to get to a time where they are only going to give you products that are going to last to a certain extent of or window of time, to ultimately you need to go and get the new model, the next model, because ultimately it's just better. So while they're doing that, ultimately, Joseph, the teacher, is getting consistent calls to have students leave his room. And it gets to the point to where the second time he's getting called, he's like, "What the heck is going on?" And so he's just like, "Okay, just..." It gets to the point to where there is an all-out just school breaking down, to the point of everyone in school for the most point is just releasing all of their kids early, because there is a seemingly uh, outpour of either parents calling the school to get their kids released early, or just there is a outpouring of parents being in front of the entire school just waiting for their kids to come out of school. And so immediately there are crazy reports going on in the news, and there is a there is seemingly being like a real outbreak of craziness going on. So they just release all the kids out early to go home and be safe. So immediately, the one of the kids go to the bathroom to get drugs from some girl, and then they start heading home for the day, because reasonably, like, there's there is a really instead of locking down the school, instead I guess they decide to, like, hey, instead of locking down the school, let's send everyone home early. And so all these kids are standing in front of the school, and all the parents are behind these locked gates, all desperately like pouring out for their son. They're like, "Oh, son, come on! Like, hey, like I need you to come here. I need you right now." And so basically, we have all these police officers that are kind of holding against this gate, keeping these gates closed from these students, and so like the parents are desperately wanting their kids, and the kids are just like, well, what should I do? What should I do? And like the teachers are just like, oh my god, like what is all this craziness going on? What is there, a bomb threat? What's going on? We don't know what's going on. And so immediately we're starting to see stuff in the news once these kids go home of what seemingly is going on. But we will also get to know what happens once these parents cannot be contained, or ultimately the kids are desperate to go to their parents' cries or screams or this and that. So let's transition for 1 second to tell you about the parents, and then we'll come back to the kids at this school where it ramps up and where it escalates onto that. So we ultimately have Brent, Nicolas Cage. We'll get to him first. Ultimately, he is at a dead end job. He is ultimately desperately telling his secretary to hold all of his calls. He ultimately doesn't want to get a call from anybody, even if it is his wife. Ultimately, we have Nicolas Cage 3 weeks before this event even happens, desperately wanting to have a pool table into his a billiard table into his basement. He wants to customize and have his own seemingly man cave, or just kind of a man cave esh, like uh, just you could call it like a fun room or something like that, but only really for Nicolas Cage, because he just wants to separate himself via the rest of the family to just have his own little space in this home. So we have it to where Nicolas Cage gets this pool table, starts to assemble it, make sure it's perfectly level so he can play pool all the live long. And Selma Blair comes down there and she's like, why did you get a billiard table? How much did this cost? And this and that. And immediately Nicolas Cage is like, so what? I bought a billiard table. I bought a pool table. I want to play some pool. And Selma Blair is mentioning him. It's like, well, like, why wouldn't we want to talk? Why wouldn't you want to talk to me about making a family room? He's like, because I don't want to actually make a family room. I want to make a room for myself. And so immediately, like, Selma Blair is not liking how basically Nicolas Cage took it upon himself to make it an entire similarly room for himself. And so basically Nicolas Cage is just going on a rampage, just complaining about how much about how much he just wants something for himself, because it's an obstacle course going through his entire house, and how he's going to trip and fall at some point and off of one of Joshua's toys and end up in the emergency room somewhere. That he just wants a room for himself to, because he makes so much money, or he used to make so much money, now he makes a smaller amount of money. And how he goes on and on about how the younger version of him would would hate the poor, pathetic schlub of who he is now, and it's basically having a midlife crisis and going on and on. And so, with Nicolas Cage having this midlife crisis, he's taking it out on this billiard table. He's like, well, you know what? If you don't want me to have this pool table in this room, like, fine, I will take care of it. And he takes a sledgehammer to this uh, to this billiard table while singing Hokey Pokey. Put your left hand in, put your left hand out, you do the Hokey Pokey, and you turn yourself around, and he's freaking sledgehammering this billiard table the entire time while doing this, and then eventually sledgehammering any portion of this house. He's sledgehammering the wall and pulling that off, and just he ultimately tells Kendall's character, Brent tells Kendall that he wasn't expecting how many sacrifices he was going to have to make, and he wasn't expecting from where he was when he was much younger that he would just be so focused on her being a mom and him being a dad, and that they would forget who they are. And Selma Blair's character is feeling the same way. Ultimately, mentioning, it's like, well, yeah, I didn't expect my life to turn out the way it was. And so reasonably, we have it to where ultimately Nicolas Cage finds out that Joshua had done something to his Cherry, his special car. And so reasonably, we have a moment where Nicolas Cage and his son are both sitting down in the front yard, and he's telling him, hey, reasonably, you messed up my car. Yeah, you messed it up, but at least you didn't mess it up as poorly as I did. Because Nicolas Cage flashes back to the moment of him with a seemingly topless woman driving around crazily with his father's car. Ultimately, a Trans Am or something like that. And so reasonably, that was his special car. He had a lot of memories going along in that car, to the point where Kendall at some point says, is like, yeah, I don't want to even imagine what kind of stuff that he had done in this car at some point, because Brent had never done anything with her in this car, but evidently he had done plenty with other women. Because ultimately, when Nicolas Cage got into a car accident and ultimately had to fork over every nickel, penny, and dime to pay back his father for every single repair that it's going to take to fix this car, but then also to pay off the entire car in whole, for Nicolas Cage to keep this car and this and that. There's a whole ordeal about Nicolas Cage having to buy this car from his father to not only fix the car, but then to buy the car from his father. It was an arm and leg and this and that, because his father loved that car and Nicolas Cage ruined it. And so reasonably, Nicolas Cage Brent is telling Josh that he's like, well, hey, you know what? It's okay that you did that with my car, but if you ever touch it again, I'm going to kill you. and at first it seems like they're joking, but then he really stares at him and he's like, I'm serious. So, turning us away to now go into Selma Blair's character Kendall. So Kendall is going to an exercise class, going into seemingly almost going into the arms of another man because she is desperate to just kind of feel something. She ultimately gets a call because ultimately she is because ultimately Kendall had told her daughter Carly, like, if she's excited about her aunt and uncle soon delivering a nephew into the world, and Carly could care less. So we have to be that Kendall gets the call that her sister, I believe, is in labor. And so immediately Kendall goes to said hospital. And again, this is where things start to escalate to help you figure out what is going on, crazily enough. So we have it to where Kendall is within the emergency room, ultimately watching her sister give birth to her first child. Bizarrely, I don't know why the sister is in there, but I guess it's just a moot point because it is what it is. So you would think it would just be the mother and father, and that would be it. Have the most limited people in there, but it seems like they have like seemingly 8 doctors in that room as well. So again, nothing makes sense. So, anyways, this girl is giving a birth to a baby, and so ultimately the doctors give her said baby. And then ultimately, bizarrely, it seems like the mother is grabbing onto this baby a little bit too tightly, to the point where the baby is starting to scream. And then, so ultimately, Selma is having to grab said baby and try as much as humanly possible to pull it away from said mother. But there's a problem. The umbilical cord is still tied to baby and mother. So they have to cut the umbilical cord. Kendall goes flying, but luckily the baby is okay. Because she's holding baby while she's kind of falling back. Um, Ultimately, the mother is getting out of the hospital bed and trying desperately to get to her baby. And the doctors are desperately grabbing onto her, realizing that she is not in the right mind to hold her baby. And so ultimately, Kendall just goes out of the room and tries to hold the baby because ultimately she just uh like it's her family, and ultimately it's not her actual baby, so she's not hurting it herself. But reasonably, the doctor and the nurse come to Kendall and say, hey, we need to take this baby because ultimately we're just very unsure whether or not anyone is going to hurt this baby. So please let me take the kid. And Kendall is just like, well, no, like if anything, like I want to make sure that like this baby's okay. And they're like, no, we have to take this baby from you. And so they take the baby, and so you just have a bunch of parents like staring blaringly at every single baby that was theirs into a room. And it's like, oh my god. So what ends up happening is now we're transitioning back to back to Carly, back to her journey. So ultimately what happens is Damon ultimately finishes his IQ test. He goes back home to ultimately get slapped by his father, and then ultimately almost stabbed with a beer bottle. But luckily, he survives to ultimately otherwise make his way to Carly. So Carly ultimately goes home with her best friend. And so reasonably, Carly starts watching the news. Her best friend is just kind of walking around the house trying to figure out what to do. And ultimately, Carly's watching the news, and everyone is like Dr. Oz is on the TV, telling like mentioning about pigs that ultimately would sadly kill their young, and this and that, and like that's what he's trying to like tie this to. And we have a bunch of other news reports ultimately telling about parents that are seemingly going after their children and doing horrible things to them. Just that's what the movie's about. So Carly's reading this report and she's like, "Oh my god, like we need to get out of here. We need to figure out a safe place to ultimately be safe." So we have Carly's best friend who ultimately goes through the house, and evidently Carly's best friend's mom, who ultimately was the girl talking to Kendall about um, trying to work out so that way uh, she could look good for her husband. And ultimately, when Kendall would have some kind of backtracking thing to say, uh, Carly's girl or Carly's best friend's mother would ultimately tell her, like, "Yeah, you skinny bitch, like shut up." So, and telling Kendall about like uh, that she doesn't want his husband to chase after 17-year-olds and this and that. So, anyways, because it's unlawful and he can't do that anyway. Anyway, it is what it is. So she we ultimately find out Kendall is kind of hearing things, and so ultimately Kendall goes to find her best friend, and in the end finds her best friend dead, and ultimately the Carly's best friend's mom isn't going to attack her because she's not her parent. But anyways, so Carly is realizing how crazy this is, and so she herself makes her way to her home, all the while also being uh, with Damon, who is her boyfriend, because ultimately he had to kill his father to make it to her. So ultimately, he's trying to see if she is safe and tell her what is going on. So they head to her home. Shortly thereafter, Carly is talking to her housekeeper. Her housekeeper is wiping off blood from the floor because evidently she had taken down her own son. And supposedly Joshua is hiding out. So ultimately, Carly finds Josh and tells him what's going on, and so immediately we have it to where Brent, aka Nicolas Cage, is making his way home. So immediately Nicolas Cage is met with Damon, and so Damon is of course Carly's boyfriend, and so Nicolas Cage is like, why are you here? Like, who are you and why are you here? And so ultimately he realizes that this is Carly's boyfriend. And so immediately he chimes in to the fact of that he's so irritated of this new generation because when looking at it, it's so easy for a younger generation to find so many adult content like things on the internet. Like he starts rattling off all of these very inappropriate words that I probably can't say on YouTube, and He's like girl on girl, and all these like different categories, and he throws in a very adult kinds of beads, let's just say. And so he's rattling all of this stuff, and it's freaking hilarious. And so he's telling this kid all this, that it's like, God, in my day, like, you couldn't find all this stuff, but this new generation can find all this stuff on the internet, and it's all one click away. And basically, I think what he's getting to is the fact that um, that he can't trust this new generation, especially uh, with this guy being with his daughter, because basically um, he can be easily swayed to otherwise uh, getting his daughter into all these kinds of acts that he does not want her to be in, and this and that. So Carly and Josh make their way to their father, and ideally, immediately, their father is ending up attacking them. But eventually, it gets to the point to where, of course, Nicolas Cage falls on one of Josh's toys and slips and trips and gets knocked out. So what ends up happening is that the kids end up going into hiding. So what ends up happening is that Carly and Josh both hide into the basement, ultimately where Nicolas Cage was trying to put a billiard table, but hokey pokey his way out of that. And so they're hiding in the basement, and ultimately they are waiting it out for them to try to be safe. So what ends up happening is Selma Blair ends up coming home, and then she comes home to wake up Nicolas Cage. Ultimately, she's like, "Well, hey, what's going on? Hey, how's your day? What's?" And immediately they kind of break into like Nicolas Cage telling them they're in the basement. Like, let's go, let's get them. And so immediately they can't exactly at first figure out uh, how to get the door open. Like Selma Blair at first goes to Carly and starts like talking to her all real nice and soft, and it's like, "Hey, yeah, like what's going on? Hey, like if anything, do you want to just unlock the door? Cuz reasonably like yeah, I love you guys and I'm just kind of concerned what's going on." And so Carly tells her that she had took money from her wallet, and some of Blair's like, "Yeah, that's okay, honey. It's like if anything, like there's a lot more pressing matters, and like yeah, if anything, if you guys just want to unlock the door and like we just need to talk. We just need to." Yeah. And so then immediately Nicolas Cage comes flying at the door, and he's like, "Motherfucker!" Like mother effing out the yin yang, and he's like, "Open the fucking door! Open it, Carly! You better open this door!" Because basically, for a bulk of this movie, Nicolas Cage is a wild dog. That it seemingly at some point he is like, ah, rah, rah. He's like barking his way through this entire movie, which I find hilarious. But like that is who he is. He is the equivalent to a wild dog on a very tight leash, because he has to be, because ultimately um, there's only so much he can do and so much he where they can go. So immediately Nicolas Cage falls to the ground next to Selma Blair, and she's like, "Well, yeah, like it's great that you said that, because like yeah, like that's not gonna work." So if anything, the first thing that they end up grabbing is is a saw's-all, and the entire time they have to mention that this saw has saws all. And the reason why that they're getting this tool is because it's an all saw. It saws all, and they have to say that repetitiously. So at first, they're trying to saw through this door, and that doesn't really quite work. So eventually, Selma breaks down, and ultimately, she decides to find the gas inside the house and pour the gas into the basement and suffocate her kids out of the room, or ultimately just kill them via that way. So ultimately, Nicolas Cage is supporting her, telling her how great the good that plan was, and ultimately just like, I love you, honey, and like, and all of this where they're trying to like home alone their kids, which is horrible, but it is what it is. So it's so absurdity at so many levels. So the kids are getting gas within the room. They are coughing it up, and then they otherwise decide, okay, here is our strategy. We are finally going to have this. We are going to take all of these matches and glue them to the very bottom of this of this uh, this door. So when eventually our parents do open this door, they light all these matches, and basically with all this gas coming in, whew, they will like explode or whatever. So the kids hide in the back, and then ultimately when uh, their parents get all kinds of tools to try to otherwise um, open this door, they are immediately engulfed in flame because they light all these matches, and so ultimately both parents go through and they fly off. So it gets to the point to where the kids, well, the jig is up, the door is off the hinges, so recently just kind of gets to the point to where the kids just start running through the entire house, trying to trap their parents and try to get them not to kill them. There's a lot of points where Selma Blair's character is running around trying to attack her daughter with a meat cleaver, or which I thought was kind of hilarious. And eventually it gets to the point to where Carly and Damon, who I guess Damon is upstairs, they try to hold Selma Blair's character into a closet, and eventually Selma Blair gets a clothing wire out and accidentally stabs Damon in, well, not accidentally, she purposely does, stabs Damon into the mouth with this clothing hanger to where ultimately he has to pull it out of his mouth. So all while doing that, Nicolas Cage is running off to try to get Joshua. And or wait a minute. Pull back a little bit. So we ultimately find out that we forgot about one thing. When ultimately the parents are attacking said kids, ultimately they corner them into the kitchen. But the thing is that it ends up being that they forget that the grandparents are supposed to come home. Ultimately, Nicolas Cage's father and mother are coming to see them because ultimately it's been a while since they've been there, and ultimately Selma Blair tells Carly that it's like, hey, we need, like, you need to see your grandparents because they're not getting any younger. So they Nicolas Cage is saw in hand, ultimately going to murder his kids. Ultimately, they're stuck in the kitchen, and then immediately there's a doorbell ringing, and Selma remind or uh, Kendall reminds Brent that ultimately, hey, your parents are here. And he's like, oh, is that today? So he goes and opens the door to get maced in the face by his mother, and then to ultimately get stabbed by his father. And then when eventually the grandparents ultimately go and notice their grandkids, ultimately Mel goes and like says to Joshua like, "Oh hey, you piss and vinegar, you little scamp." But immediately he starts trying to kill Nicolas Cage again, because ultimately this is a whole generational thing to where ultimately Carly runs away from her mother, and eventually Josh runs away from his father. And so you have to where Josh runs into the garage to into Nicolas Cage's Cherry, his Grand Trans Am or whatever car. So Nicolas Cage goes and shatters the glass ceiling of his car, and then eventually he is trying to grab at his son. All while doing that, his father is coming into his car on top of him to repetitiously either stab him in the leg or just try and repetitiously, continually try to stab him. And so immediately, like, Nicolas Cage tells his own father, "Get off me, you old dinosaur!" And Mel, his father, is telling him like, "Dinosaur." It's like, dude, I fought in a war. What have you done? And tries to kill him. So while this is going on, Joshua is sneaking out of the car, and ultimately he is otherwise um, trying to find a way to get away from his own father. So he's sneaking behind the car, but ultimately the car is backing up a little bit to almost kill Joshua. He ducks out at the right time, and we eventually get to the point to where this car crashes through the garage, ultimately uh, in turn having uh, Brent, Nicolas Cage's father, flying through the car ultimately to get killed. And all the while, Selma Blair, Carly, and everybody else is outside of this house. So immediately, like, we have it to where at some point before this, when Kendall and Nicolas Cage's mother was in the kitchen, ultimately Selma Blair's character was trying to prevent Nicolas Cage's mother from trying to kill Nicolas Cage's character. And so they were like tossing and turning and just like, hey, like trying to stop one another. And so immediately she was like, you can't kill your son. And so she's uh, like Kendall's not even a real name, and you're a whore, and this and that, all the insults that she could possibly tell her. So cue them going outside and now otherwise noticing that uh, this like hellacious car crash. So we eventually have it to where uh, within all of this, counting the chips where they may, we have it to where after all this scrambling and running around, people trying to kill people, and everything in between, we have to where now Carly and Joshua and Damon have both Selma Blair and Nicolas Cage tied up in the basement to this pipe. And because ultimately, I believe Nicolas Cage's mother is also dead because Nicolas Cage is still alive. So justifiably, basically, Carly and Josh are speaking to their parents, and they're telling them that they love them and everything like that. And but both the parents are trying to break free. They're ultimately trying to get out of the ties that the kids put them in. Ultimately, they're telling them, "Yeah, I love you." Like the parents are telling their kids, "Is like, well, I love you too." But there's just really times when I just really want to just I just really just want to just kill you. Um, but yeah, so and immediately that is just how the movie just ends with like all of this is just quasi resolved. It's not that the parents die, it's just that the kids find a ways to tie them up, and I guess that is just going to be the way that we just resolve things, with the parents being uh, tied within the home, and that is how the kids, I guess, win the day. So, anyways, I think that's all I'm going to say about this review. If at any point I left something out, or ultimately wasn't being specific enough about certain things, because at the end of the day, there's probably a lot to say about this movie, I do otherwise apologize. But at the end of the day, there's a lot going on in this movie, and it's a very strange and odd movie that I just had to re-review. So I'm gonna get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.